Thank you so much for honoring me with this invitation. I'm particularly grateful that it's also given me an opportunity to renew my friendship with Basel, which is a city that I have very, very fond memories of. And my sons, who were then 5 and 10, have never forgotten being spoiled rotten by Dr. Erika Suter and her friends. And so I hope that my contributions here tonight will make some little amends for the enormous generosity that the city has shown me. I am going to be talking about matters that are very difficult to talk about, which is how does one negotiate the roles of liberation movement and ruling party, as they called it, but I call it the governing party, and ask the question, does the ANC centenary mark progress in socio-economic equity and democratic freedom for the majority? I believe we are all seeking illumination. We all are people full of hope, and we are all seeking innovations and solutions to understanding how this most blessed, most beautiful, and yet heavily burdened of all countries, South Africa, finds itself under the governance of a century-old African National Congress. Centuries are enormously powerful milestones, and so we have to congratulate the African National Congress for this milestone. But in order to do justice to this weighty and yet worthwhile exploration, my address will take the following format. First, I will discuss the difficulty of making the transition from liberation movements to governing parties globally. These difficulties take the form of philosophical dilemmas, the plagues of undercapacity, and the sins of incumbency. Second, I will look at the consequences of failing to deal with the inherited challenges of socio-economic inequities and a disintegrated economy in the most creative and courageous ways possible. And finally, I will consider an approach that promises to alter the trajectory the ANC, alongside a principally complacent citizenry, up until now, has placed South Africa on. I would like to propose that what is needed is igniting the citizen to reevaluate his or her role as the shareholder in the driving seat of a democracy, rather than as a subject of benevolent liberators. So let's start with looking at how does one negotiate the transition of roles of liberation movement to governing party. Africa continues to wrestle with the challenges of transitions from post-colonial underdevelopment to realize the dream of claiming the 21st century. For Africa to successfully claim its rightful place in the globally interconnected and interdependent world, it will have to make a fundamental shift from liberation struggle politics to democratic politics. Africa suffers from weak political, social, and economic institutional systems and frameworks planning and implementing appropriate policies. promise of the new partnership for Africa's development embodied in its launch in the early 2000s has yet to bear fruit. Better governance, quelling conflicts, investment in Africa's people, and ensuring shared prosperity for all remain distant dreams for those still caught up in struggles between political elites over the spoils of victory in many countries. Systems of governance based on liberation movement politics have characterized many of the governments in post-colonial Africa. Former leaders of resistance and liberation movements have tended to see themselves as the natural leaders of governments. Insufficient thought seems to have been given to African citizens and leaders to the possibility of a mismatch between the skill set required for governance and that of freedom fighters. In Architects of Poverty, Mwelezi Mbeki identifies the failure of leadership by African elites as being at the heart of its inability to harness its considerable natural and human resources to establish sustainable prosperity for its people. At the heart of the failure of leadership is the lack of a frame of reference for governance that makes a fundamental break with the colonial past. Leaders of most liberation movements derive their education and training from the very systems they later set out to oppose or even wage war against. But opposition to a system does not necessarily signal a commitment to a radically different system of governance. It is striking how many African countries have replicated the very colonial governance systems they purported to uphold. The very fact of African countries today still defining themselves as Francophonie, Lusophonie, and Anglophonie demonstrates how deeply Africa has imbibed the values, the systems, languages, and symbols replete with white wigs of their former masters. Embarrassing as this is, it is but an external manifestation of a deeper and more devastating reality, which is that most former liberation movements have failed to make the transition into credible democratic governance machines framed by the pursuit of the ideals of social justice that inspired the very struggles for freedom they committed to. Prince Mashele, in The Death of Our Society, puts the blame squarely on the failure to acknowledge the crippling trap that a number of post-colonial African societies have proven incapable of escaping heroism. Heroism is defined here as a way of thinking that makes multitudes of people believe that their social, political, and economic fates depend on the actions or benevolence of special individuals in society who possess extraordinary abilities and powers that are beyond ordinary citizens. South Africa has not escaped this trap. As we shall see below, it seems that our country received the most complex and binding of all of them. The blessing of a leader in the person of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela as the hero of our struggle for liberation and the first president of democratic South Africa comes with the curse of entrapment. Our to escape the trap of heroic politics and make the transition to a more open society and true multi-party democracy depends on our willingness to take the risk of going beyond liberation politics. Such a step requires vision and courage to forge a path that many African countries have failed to follow. On the 11th of February 1990, the day of Nelson Mandela's release from prison, he made the following statement: "The white monopoly of political power must be ended, and we need a fundamental restructuring of our political and economic systems to address the inequalities of apartheid and create a genuine democratic South Africa." Peter Branch refers to this statement in his book called Lost in Transformation, and I quote, "It is 22 years since Mandela envisaged his great agenda, but very little of this agenda has been realized. The new political economic system that was institutionalized during the negotiations turned out to be highly dysfunctional. Granted, the socio-economic legacy bequeathed by the apartheid regime to the ANC was in many respects a bankrupt one. But one can see with the wisdom of hindsight that without doubt, the opportunity to create a political economic system that could have addressed the deeply ingrained and deep-seated poverty problem was squandered when a neoliberal political economic system was institutionalized to serve the narrow interests of the old white elite and the emerging black elite." Close quotes. My generation had assumed that the idealism we had shared as activists would dictate that the transformation needed to move from freedom fighters to citizens of a democracy would occur as smoothly as caterpillars turn into butterflies. Instead, we see caterpillars turning into fat cats. Of late, an increasing number of butterflies having to challenge the state to protect the pillars upon which our democracy is founded and to perform on its most basic function. The key reason for the failure to make the transition from liberation politics to democratic politics lies in the radical difference in the values framework between the two forms of politics. Liberation movements tend to simplify socio-economic and political conflicts as simply black and white issues. No ambiguity is tolerated. Democratic politics, on the other hand, is the art of the possible. In addressing conflicts of interest and tensions between the in and the out groups who have the right to express their views in an environment where freedom of expression is one of the central rights. In addition, the equality principle within a democracy is often undermined by the sense of entitlement to government because one was a member of the liberation movement and an aggrieved person from past regimes. The intolerance for differences of opinion within and outside of the liberation movement and the assumption of loyalty even in the face of evidence that comrades broke the law or undermined accountability are at the heart of the incompatibility between liberation and democratic politics. The strident voices against any form of criticism as anti-revolutionary and the most subversive acts against the democratic principles embedded in our constitutional democracy. The ANC leadership has become more and more intolerant and less willing to appreciate the importance of listening to citizens as the one to whom they are accountable. Only a radical redefinition of politics can remedy this situation. The very nature of power would have to be redefined in a new paradigm that puts the citizen back at the center of the political process where he or she belongs. There is no global example of success in making the transition from liberation politics to democratic politics. Britain knew better than to expect Sir Winston Churchill to lead the reconstruction process after World War II. They voted him out and put in civilian leadership in place. The Swedes also recognized that the warriors who had successfully fought off the invaders in their country in the 17th century would not be the appropriate leaders to build the social democracy afterwards. They thanked their warriors, decorated them, provided them with adequate pensions and housing, and let them go. Post-colonial Africa, including South Africa, have failed to learn the lessons from this history. So what are the consequences of this failed transition? The failure to comprehend the enormity and complexity of transforming the unequal distribution of income among South Africans and the potential of that failure to threaten our democracy was an inevitable consequence of the heroism and triumphant post-liberation politics. The following statistics reflect a very grim picture. 1, the distribution of income of the total population in South Africa in 2008 showed that the top 20%, which means 10 million individuals, received close to 75% of total income, whilst the poorest 50%, which means 25 million individuals, received less than 8%. Further, 83% of whites, we're talking about 3.7 million people, were among the top 20% that I referred to. 25% of colored people were also in that category, which is 1.1 million people. And then 60% of Indian people were also amongst this top 20%. Third, the real problematic aspect of this inequality is that 95% of African people, or 23.7 million individuals, were amongst the poorest 50% of the population, whilst 5% of colored people were amongst the poorest 50% of the population. This is an incredible and unsustainable state of affairs. The fact that the Gini coefficient increased from 0.66 in 1992 to 0.7 in 2008 is an indication that income has become more and more unequally distributed during the democratic period, where one would have expected otherwise. So, how do we explain this? Tolerance for gross inequalities left to fester comprises one important reason that we witness today a South Africa once again teetering on a knife edge of massive and widespread violent outbreaks. The structural inequalities that Marikana so dramatically revealed and which has spread to other minds is not sustainable. Knowing that equality and social justice were central to entrenching our fledgling democracy, why did we not take substantial measures to protect it? Why were we not vigilant as our country deserved? The answer is twofold. First, we did not anticipate that South Africa would go the way of other post-colonial African countries. We were supposed to be exceptional. Secondly, we underestimated the impact of the authoritarian culture we have all imbibed from our cultural and political history on our ability to challenge authority and hold our leaders accountable in a constitutional democracy. In addition, our humble beginnings as individuals born in poverty, many of us, by and large, and the lack of experience of democracy and its governance and management undermined our capacity to manage the risks of handling power, money, and wealth without being corrupted by it. The ANC and its alliance partners' rhetoric about the need for a second transition, which was very audible middle of this year, is the closest we have ever come to an acknowledgement by the governing elites of their failure to govern. Any government of a constitutional democracy that has presided over 18 years of system failure in the four core functions of government: education, health, safety and security, and employment creation, can legitimately said to have failed. These four core functions are fundamental pillars of socio-economic equity, setting the foundation on which the opportunities of socio-economic advancement evolve. Let us take a step back and see what we are dealing with. We have a government that cannot provide learning and teaching facilities to promote the rights and dignity of every child. Nor can it provide the learning materials needed to guide learners and teachers in the majority of schools, as illustrated in the infrastructure and textbook sagas in the Eastern Cape and Limpopo provinces. The basic functions of appointing teachers and principals to nurture talent of our children is beyond the capacity of the government in key poor provinces. Low standards are set for both teaching and learning to cover up its inability to manage performance of teachers and other officials who are its employees. The education system, taken on its own, is a primary generator of poverty, inequality, and has destroyed opportunities of successive generations to aspire to and achieve the kind of socio-economic equity which will allow them to find a path to a brighter future. The National Planning Commission has written that, and I quote, "For those South Africans who are excluded from the formal economy, live in informal settlement, depend on social services which are either absent or of very poor quality, the political transition is yet to translate into a better life." According to Minister Trevor Manuel, who heads up the National Planning Commission, and these are his words, "We have gained much and reached extraordinary political milestones over the last 18 years, but we haven't arrived at the promised land, and we are woefully behind delivering economic freedom and rights to the majority of South Africans. Put simply, we have yet to make our magnificent constitution a living reality for millions of South Africans. close quotes. The rhetoric of the need for a second transition by segments of the ANC represents a real and present danger to our constitutional democracy by attempting to silence constructive criticism of its performance. It reinvents history by suggesting that a two-stage process of transformation was part of the settlement process, with the first stage focused on political and the second on socio-economic justice. Protagonists of this second transition make assertions without a shred of evidence that the constitution negotiated by visionary leaders across the party political spectrum is an obstacle to transformation of our society into the social justice nation of our dreams. For example, they deliberately tap into the emotive issue of land and land reform by charging that the Constitution prevents land reform, amongst others, by a clause that does not exist in our Constitution, willing buyer, willing seller. This is a classic case of a fallacy which, if repeated often enough, becomes fact to the hearer. The reality is that in most parts of South Africa, the state is the largest landowner, but there is no capacity in government to turn its ownership into an advantage in the transformation process. Human settlement patterns have not changed in the last 18 years because there is little appetite nor is there capacity for transformative programs to dismantle apartheid geography. The little land reform that has been implemented is collapsing under monumental execution failures that leave new black owners without the means to create sustainable livelihoods, let alone make the transition to commercial farming. The obstacle to land reform is not the Constitution. The threat by some leaders of the Tripartite Alliance to change the Constitution at the earliest opportunity in order to remove these supposed obstacles to social justice is dangerous. Lessons must be learned from other post-colonial settings on our continent. We need to defend and protect the Constitution, which is the ultimate guarantor of democracy and social justice. The Constitution has been the only defense available to poor communities to compel the government to perform, be it in the provision of antiretrovirals for HIV/AIDS treatment, school textbooks, or the appointment of teachers in the Eastern Cape. We need to remember that it took the silence of educated middle and upper classes in Zimbabwe to allow Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF to destroy the economy in the name of destroying imperialism. The devastating impact of governance failures on the quality of our human capital undermines our ability to compete in today's knowledge-based, globally connected economic environment. Our low levels of economic growth and the unsustainably high levels of unemployment, especially amongst the youth, estimated in some areas to be about 60%, are a direct result of these failures. Elites, including the very teachers, the very nurses, and the very public officials serving the failed public system, have basically bought themselves out of the failing education, health, and public safety systems. They rely on private services. Poor people are left to fend for themselves and made to pay for the luxurious lifestyles that rich black and white people enjoy. Unequal societies pay a very high price for the prestige-based structural hierarchies that evolve in such settings. South Africa pays more for banking services, mobile technology, food, beverages, clothing, partly because of the status attached to the ability to pay. So, Mr. Unnamed afford a bottle of whiskey for 800 rand? No problem. 1,000? No problem. 2,000? No problem. The more expensive, the higher the status. The failure by the state to regulate is due to a combination of conflicts of interest and incompetence by officials employed in these entities. The establishment of Chancellor House, an investment vehicle for the governing party to do business with government, extraordinary, is the most shameful example of how the ANC has captured the state to benefit its loyalists and to stay in power. The participation of Chancellor House in investments such as Hitachi, a supplier of state-owned enterprise ESCOM, as a black economic empowerment beneficiary undermines the stated intentions of the black economic empowerment policy. Poor black people who are supposed to benefit from the broadening of the base of participation in the economy are being cheated yet again by predominantly black elites in government. The very existence of Chancellor House, with its vast tentacles in the economy, promotes fronting and cynicism amongst participants in the private sector. Our inability to transform our public service and to establish a professional, competent one, as required by our Constitution, has had a devastating impact on the quality of governance and change in the lives of the most vulnerable in our society. Those passionate about social justice should turn their attention to the importance of good governance, professionalism, and intolerance of incompetence and corruption. Poor people are disproportionately affected by corruption and public service failures. Studies everywhere in the world demonstrate that corruption is a tax on poor people. Bribes and withholding of services weigh heavily on poor people. Our level of corruption in South Africa and maladministration has reached levels that now define our very political culture. President Zuma stated in Parliament recently, without any hint of irony, that there is nothing wrong with politicians doing business with government. He is clearly not in touch with the reality on how such insider trading has left poor people destitute. No roads, no water, no schools, etc. Politicians serving their own business interests have no place in a constitutional democracy. Also alarming is the latest report of the Auditor General, Mr. Terence Nombe, which stated that public officials at local, provincial, national levels simply ignore adverse audit reports and repeat offenders are the order of the day. The Auditor General details serious problems in supply chain management, security of government information, and accuracy of government reports. He found that people in key positions are not equipped to do what they are expected to do. A culture of impunity has set in and has become entrenched in our public service over the last 18 years. There are many documents and books that have been written on the state of affairs, which I will not bore you with, but they will be included in the paper. But amongst others is After the Party, which details how an unneeded, unnecessary arms deal has actually corrupted the whole body politic in South Africa. We've also allowed the criminal world to find South Africa as a playground in a book called Killing Kevin. The common thread running through these works is that South Africa is deeply mired in the treachery that years of apartheid rule, liberation struggle, and sanctions-busting business activity has entrenched. Corruption on this scale has a direct impact on the socio-economic conditions of South Africans. It is almost as if some people believe the proverbial pie will grow to accommodate the greed on one hand and the needs of South Africans on the other. But it cannot. The only defense poor people have against impunity and disrespect from fellow citizens is the Constitution and other citizens. We dare not allow those who peddle fallacies about our Constitution to rob poor people of the only reliable defense of their freedom and a platform for demanding social justice. So, what is to be done? Post-colonial Africa and its supporters have ignored the role and place of citizens in establishing and strengthening democracies. The focus in the post-conflict period has often been on pacifying belligerents. This pacification often includes them in the process of government, giving them a sense of entitlement to government. The reality is that there is not a single post-liberation movement in Africa, perhaps in the rest of the world, that has made this successful transition to democratic government. That should embolden citizens to challenge the assumption of entitlement to govern by virtue of engagement in liberation struggles. On the contrary, that might well be the basis for disqualification from the governance process. For that to happen, we need to ask bold questions of ourselves as citizens and of our governments. I have decided to draw on my roots and my activism to establish the citizen movement, drawing lessons from the Black consciousness movement of the 1970s. Our analysis as a citizen movement is that only a people numbed by woundedness will tolerate what we are witnessing in our country today. South Africans, black and white, are deeply wounded by the legacy of racism, sexism, and engineered inequality over the last 3 centuries, which in the past 18 years we have failed to transform. The majority of black people suffer still from an inferiority complex that is deep-seated. Both rich and poor black South Africans are affected. The humiliation of being told in more ways than one that one is inferior is deeply wounding and infuriating. But the lack of self-respect engendered leads to inward-directed anger, domestic violence, community vigilantism, public violence, and other self-sabotaging behavior, including looting of public resources and supporting failure of governance. Denial of mistakes and failure is a common feature of woundedness. Wounded people also tend to be subservient to authoritarian leaders and fail to hold them accountable. Many white people still suffer from a superiority complex that leads them to believe that they are entitled to have more material benefits than their black fellow citizens by virtue of their superior qualities and their hard work. There are also many who are paralyzed by guilt about the past, racist practices, and feel that they have no right to exercise their rights and responsibilities as citizens, including criticizing majority black governments. The tendency of deferring to authority is strong and deep-seated amongst white people too. Neither superiority complex nor guilt is helpful to the transformation process that is so sorely needed in our country. Lessons of history are clear. If you think of yourself as helpless and ineffectual, you sow the seeds of becoming victims of despotic governments and allow them to become your master. South Africans need to complete the healing process that was started by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and focus on the psychosocial and economic wounds that beset our nation. We need to link hands, black and white, men and women, young and old, as well as rich and poor, as citizens, and start circles of healing amongst ourselves as a nation. There are wonderful initiatives across the country, led by civil society groups and individuals that are wrestling with the challenge of healing the nation. What is needed is identifying, coalescing, galvanizing, and amplifying these efforts so the whole can be larger than the sum of the parts. We need to generate a momentum among citizens to demand change in the quality of governance. Middle and upper class citizens must realize that it is in their interest to speed up the elimination of poverty and destitution as part of the healing process. As the French philosopher Aron so aptly remarked, too great a degree of inequality makes human community impossible. No one wins in a grossly unequal society. One of the most urgent campaigns citizens need to wage in South Africa is to put to bed the sunset electoral clause that made provision for only proportional representation in a closed party-list system that is the nature of our electoral system in South Africa today. This electoral system erodes public accountability of the elected representatives to the citizen. This is one of the sunset clauses that was supposed to have been reviewed 5 years after the dawn of our democracy. But it was retained by the ANC government with the acquiescence of opposition parties. Our electoral system has literally taken power away from voters and has given it to party bosses who decide who is on the list, in what order, and ensures the loyalty of those elected to parliament to be directed at the party and not to the country. A major effort, therefore, needs to be made to promote civic education, including a campaign for long overdue changes to the closed list proportional representation electoral system. Let me conclude. South Africans are waking up to the truism that no democracy can function effectively and efficiently without the active engagement of citizens. The consolidation of our democracy requires citizens, the corporate sector, civil society organizations, and the government to work and walk together to tackle the challenges of transforming our legacy into a success story. I remain convinced that South Africans are a resilient people. We have, in recent history, demonstrated our capacity to pull back from the brink of disaster and even surprise ourselves. I have no doubt that South Africa is a country destined to turn its rich endowments in natural, mineral, and human resources into greatness. The dawn of that greatness can be seen even as dark clouds are hovering on the horizon. We need to keep reminding ourselves that the darkest hour is often just before the bursting forth of a new day. I thank you.